The winter that broke the valley came in on a Tuesday, without apology, and by Wednesday morning there was not a family between the river and the ridge that had not looked into their barn and felt the particular cold that has nothing to do with temperature. It is the cold of an empty place. But there was one barn that was not empty. There was one barn so full that the door would barely latch, so packed with hay from floor to rafter that the mice had taken up residence in the walls rather than wade through it. And the barn belonged to a 23-year-old woman named Clara Marsh, who had moved onto the old Deller property in late April with $40, a lame mule, and absolutely no reputation to speak of. The town had watched her arrive. The town had made its assessment quickly, as small towns do, and the assessment was not kind. And then the blizzard came, and the town came to Clara's door, and Clara did a thing that nobody who had mocked her would have predicted, though anyone who truly knew her would have said it was the only thing she could possibly have done. But that is where every good story ends, and this one must begin 300 bales earlier. 3 months before the blizzard, in the late summer heat that settled over Harlan Crossing like a judgment, a farmer named Odell Pratt drove his wagon into the yard of the Consolidated Grain and Feed Office and tried to sell 300 bales of hay. The hay had gotten wet. Not ruined, not rotted through, but wet enough that the top third of each bale had taken on a grayish cast, a color that looked, to the untrained eye, like mold and ruin and money wasted. Odell Pratt was a meticulous man in most respects, but he had stacked this particular cutting too close to an unchinked wall, and a week of August rain had found the gap. And now he stood in the yard of the feed office trying to explain to Harlan Crossing's most important merchant, a man named Cutter Baines, that the hay was sound at the core. Cutter Baines walked around the wagon once. He prodded a bale with one boot. He looked at the color, and he looked at Odell, and he made an offer of nothing. Not a low offer, an offer of nothing. He said the hay was unfit for sale, and he would not have it in his warehouse, and if Odell was wise, he would burn it before it contaminated his good stock. Odell Pratt drove home with his wagon still full, and a face like a man who had been told something he already feared was true. Word reached Clara the way most things reached her that summer, through the gaps in conversation she overheard from the far end of the feed store counter, or through the careful attention she paid to wagon traffic on the county road she could see from her kitchen window. She had been watching that road all summer. It was cheaper than gossip and more accurate. She had seen Odell's wagon go into town heavy and come back heavier, and she knew what that meant before anyone told her. She went to see him that same evening. Odell Pratt was a taciturn man, and he was sitting on his porch with the look of a man doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. Clara climbed down from her wagon, introduced herself as the woman who had taken the Deller place, and asked if she could look at the hay. He waved her toward the barn without getting up. She was in there for a long time. She pulled bales apart with her hands. She smelled them. She looked at the dark centers and the pale outer layer, and she thought about what she knew, which was considerable for a 23-year-old who had grown up helping her uncle run a small operation in the hill country further east. And what she knew was this: wet hay that has dried improperly will smell sweet-sour and feel warm inside, the heat of fermentation, which is the heat of something dying. This hay smelled of nothing but rain and dry grass. It was not fermenting. It had gotten wet and dried in the field before baling, which had given it that gray cast, and then it had gotten a second wetting in storage, which had done the same to the outer layer. But the core of each bale was sound. It was not beautiful hay. It would not win any prizes at the county fair. But it would feed animals through a winter, and Clara Marsh was very much in need of something that would feed animals through a winter. She came back out and asked Odell Pratt what he wanted for it. He said Baines had offered nothing. She said she was not Baines. He named a price out of pure exhaustion, $20 for the lot of 300 bales, which worked out to less than 7 cents a bale, which was not a price so much as a concession to despair. Clara said she would take them all. Odell looked at her for the first time since she'd arrived. He said, "It'll take 3 wagon loads to haul it." She said she had a wagon, and she had a mule, and she had time. He said, "Your barn is half the size of mine, and it can't hold 300 bales." She said she would make it hold. He did not argue further. He was too tired and too grateful, and perhaps, somewhere beneath both of those things, a little curious about what she intended. The old man who lived on the property that bordered Clara's to the north was named Hiram Vassos. He had come from somewhere in the old country, a specific somewhere he never named directly, but that you could hear in the particular music of his speech, and he had been farming the thin soil of that hillside for 31 years, long enough that the land had taken on a quality of partnership rather than possession. He grew a modest garden, kept a few goats, and spent most of his time in a quiet that other people mistook for absence. He was not absent. He noticed everything. He had noticed Clara Marsh the day she arrived, and he had watched her through the summer with the patient attention of a man who has learned not to rush his assessments. He came over the hill one evening in early September, the week after she had hauled the first load of Odell's gray hay home, and he stood at the edge of her yard and looked at the pile she had unloaded beside the barn, and he said nothing for a long while. Then he said, "That hay has been talked about in town." Clara said she supposed it had. He said, "Baines told 3 men it was ruined, and those 3 men told everyone, and now everyone knows that the woman on the Deller place bought Odell Pratt's bad hay for $20. She said she was aware of that." He walked to the pile and lifted a corner of a bale and smelled it. He held it for a moment. Then he said, "My father had an expression." In the language of wherever he came from, which she did not know, it translated roughly as this: "The ground does not care what you believe about it. It keeps its own accounts. A thing is worth what it does, not what it looks like when it is standing still." Clara looked at him. She said, "That is a long expression." He smiled. He said, he was a long man. She hired him to help her stack, which he did without complaint, and with the efficiency of someone who had been stacking things since before she was born. And in 3 weekends and several evenings after supper, they had all 300 bales inside the barn, the last 100 requiring a reorganization of everything else in the building, a relocation of her 3 milk goats to a temporary lean-to she built against the barn's south wall, and a creative rearrangement of her modest tool collection that Hiram observed with what she could only describe as respectful bewilderment. When the last bale was in and the door was latched, they stood outside in the cooling September air, and the barn looked like a barn that had eaten something too large and was considering its choices. She had at this point 11 goats, 4 of which she had bought in June, 4 which had come with the property in various states of dilapidation, and 3 which were the offspring of those 4, born in July to her considerable and private satisfaction. She also had 6 chickens, one of which was named Gerald by a neighboring child named Bess, who was 9 years old and had decided that Clara's farm was a second home, and Clara's animals were her personal friends. And Clara had not objected to either arrangement because Bess had a gift for the chickens and because Clara, though she would not have said so plainly, was grateful for the company. Bess named all the chickens eventually. She named them after people she found interesting. Gerald was named for a school teacher. There was also a Penelope, a Mrs. Croft, 2 sisters named after a pair of washerwomen, and the largest and most opinionated of the 6, a fat red hen, who Bess named Commander and who spent most of her time staring at the barn door as though she expected it to apologize. This was Clara's whole operation in September: 11 goats, 6 chickens with names, 1 lame mule who was improving, a barn full of hay that the town had already written its judgment on, and $20 spent. She had 37 cents in a tin on the windowsill. She had enough to eat because the garden had been generous and she had worked it hard all summer. She had enough to continue because she had kept her costs at a number so small it barely counted as arithmetic, but she was running calculations in the evenings that were not comfortable calculations. The winter feed was solved, at least on paper. What she needed now was income, and income meant milk sold, and milk sold meant more goats, and more goats meant... But here the arithmetic became circular, and she would close the ledger and sit in the dark for a while before beginning it again. What she did not know in September was that the winter coming would not be any ordinary winter. She could not have known it. The signs were there for someone with the knowledge to read them, and Hiram Vassos had that knowledge, and he mentioned it to her once in early October in the manner of a man stating a fact about soil rather than issuing a warning. He said, "The creek dropped 3 weeks earlier than it should, and the hornets have built deep this year, and the sky has had that particular quality in the mornings, flat and pale, in a way that means pressure." She asked him what that added up to. He said, "It adds up to a barn full of hay." She said, "I have a barn full of hay." He said, "Yes, you do." October passed in work. She sold milk to 3 families in Harlan Crossing, not through the feed store, where Baines would have taken his percentage and his commentary, but directly, carrying it in herself 2 mornings a week on the wagon. The families did not advertise that they were buying from her. They were not unfriendly, but they were cautious in the way that people are when the town has made a verdict and they are not sure yet which side of it to stand on. She priced the milk fairly, below what Baines charged through the store, and said nothing about it to anyone. She let the thing speak in the only way she trusted, in the counting of coins and the continuation of orders. November came cold, too early. The creeks that Hiram had watched drop in September froze over in the first week, which had not happened in 11 years, a fact that the older residents of Harlan Crossing noted with the particular unease of people who remember what it means when the old patterns change. The feed store began selling hay faster than it received it, because the cold had arrived before most families had put up their full winter stores, and because the summer had been dry enough in the high meadows that the big cutting had come in thin, and because Cutter Baines had not bought enough, a failure of judgment that he attributed publicly to the difficulty of reliable supply and privately to nothing, because Cutter Baines did not conduct private audits of his own errors. By the last week of November, the store hay was at a price that made grown men stand in the feed lot and stare at the ground. Clara heard about it on a Wednesday from Bess, who had a network of information that would have impressed a military commander, gathered from her many walks between her family's house and Clara's barn, and the various points in between, where adults talked without considering who might be listening. Bess reported the price with the calm of a journalist. She also reported that a man named Henderson, who farmed the wide bottom below town, had already sold 2 of his horses because he could not afford to feed them through to spring. Clara listened to all of this, and then she asked Bess if she had eaten. Bess said she had not, particularly. Clara fed her and sent her home with a jug of milk, and then she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and did the arithmetic for a long time. She counted the hay, 300 bales. Her animals would need perhaps 80 to 90 bales to last comfortably through to April, even in a hard winter, which left her with something between 210 and 220 bales she did not need for her own stock. She counted the price that Baines was now asking, which was considerable, and she counted the price she had paid, which was 7 cents a bale, and the difference between those 2 numbers was the kind of number that could solve a winter. She could charge what Baines charged, or close to it, and by spring she would be a different person financially than the one who had arrived in April with $40. She sat with that number for the rest of the evening. It was a real and tempting number. She did not pretend otherwise. Then she closed the ledger and went to bed. It was in the third week of November that Cutter Baines came to see her. She was in the yard splitting wood when his buggy came down the lane, and she watched him come without stopping the work, which meant he arrived to the side of a young woman in a barn coat, bringing a maul down on a round of oak with the focused efficiency of someone who has found the grain and is following it. He stepped down from the buggy and said good morning in the tone of a man who has rehearsed his warmth. He was a broad, prosperous-looking man of perhaps 50, with a merchant's hands, soft and deliberate, and he looked at her barn the way a man looks at something he had previously failed to correctly appraise. He said he had heard she had hay. She said another round on the block and said she supposed he had. He said it was a fortunate thing to have hay going into a hard winter, and he imagined she was looking to sell some of it, since a woman managing a property alone could not possibly need 300 bales for her modest operation, and he would be happy to serve as a middleman, to spare her the difficulty of dealing directly with buyers. And he could offer her, here he named a price, which was not quite the price he was charging his own customers, but which was several times what she had paid, and which he delivered with the air of a man being more than fair. Clara split the oak. She stacked the two halves. She picked up the next round. She said, "Mr. Baines, you told Odell Pratt that hay was unfit for sale." He said that was before he understood the full situation, and conditions had changed, and in his professional assessment, the hay was certainly serviceable for emergency use. She said, "It was serviceable in August, when Odell needed you to say so. He said he wasn't here to relitigate past business." She said, "No. You're here because you're short, and you think I have something you need, and you'd like to get it at a price that still lets you profit on both ends." He looked at her with a smile that was working very hard. He said something about a woman alone being wise to have friends in the business community, about the advantages of a reliable distribution partner, about how difficult it was for a small operator to reach the right buyers directly. Clara brought them all down. She said, "I've already reached the right buyers directly." Baines stood in the yard for another moment. Then he got back in his buggy and drove up the lane, and Clara watched him go. And the quality of her watching was not triumphant. It was simply the watching of a person who has identified a thing clearly and is filing it away. The blizzard began on the second Tuesday of December at 4 o'clock in the morning, which Clara knew because she had been awake since 3, as she often was, and she heard the wind change. It changed the way Hiram had described the previous week, not a gradual increase, but an abrupt shift from stillness to a sound like something enormous moving through the dark. She dressed and went to the barn and checked every animal and banked the stove in the house and brought in 3 days of wood. And she did all of this before the snow was even knee-deep, because she had been listening to the sky all autumn, and she understood what was coming. By midday the county road was impassable. By evening you could not see the barn from the house. The snow came for 3 days, and it was a snow of a particular ferocity that the oldest people in the valley would say, afterward, that they had not seen in 40 years. It sealed everything. It buried fences to their tops. It collapsed 2 roofs in town and 1 in the countryside. And the countryside one was a barn roof. And the barn belonged to a family named Esterbrook, who had kept their hay in it. And now the hay and the barn were a single compressed object under 4 feet of snow, and the Esterbrook animals had nothing. On the morning of the 4th day the snow stopped, and the sky went the color of a tin pan, and the cold that followed was a cold with intention. Clara dug out her own path and went to see Hiram first. He was fine. He had put his goats inside the house, which he did not explain, and she did not question. He came out with her, and together they dug to the road. They were the first people on the county road that morning, and the first person they encountered was Odell Pratt, who was walking because his horse had thrown a shoe in the barn during the storm, and he had not been able to get the farrier. And he was walking because one of his neighbors had no hay at all, and he was going to see about it. He stopped when he saw Clara. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something complicated in his face. The memory of what he had sold her, and what it had been worth, and what it was worth now, and what that meant about the summer, and about Baines, and about the woman standing in the road in front of him who had been right about all of it. He said, "I suppose you're fixed for feed." She said, "I have extra." He stopped. He said, "How much extra?" She said, 200 bales, approximately. He was quiet. He said, "You know what Baines is asking?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And what are you asking?" She looked down the white road at nothing in particular, and then she named a price. It was not the price Baines was asking. It was not even close. It was a fair price, calculated on what the hay had actually cost her, and what a reasonable return looked like, and what she knew about these families and this valley, and what the next 3 months were going to require of all of them. And when she said it, Odell Pratt's face did something she had not entirely expected, which was to go a little loose around the jaw, as though he had braced for a blow and been handed something entirely different. He said, "That is not what I would have charged." She said, "No, but it is what I am charging." The word went through the valley faster than she could have managed it herself, which was fortunate, because she did not have time to manage it. She was too busy shifting hay and coordinating wagons, and dealing with the extraordinary logistical reality of distributing 200 bales of hay to 12 different farms in conditions that made every journey an adventure in persistence. Bess appeared on the second day, uninvited and entirely necessary, and organized the record-keeping with a small notebook she had clearly been waiting for a reason to use. She wrote down each farm's name and the number of bales they received and the price agreed upon, and she did it with the gravity of a person who understands that numbers mean something and that getting them right is a form of honor. Cutter Baines was not part of this. He was discovered on the third day of distribution to have attempted to purchase hay from 3 farms to the south of the valley at a price he could then resell at his standard markup. A reasonable enterprise on its face, except that 2 of those 3 farms had already privately committed their small reserve stock to their own neighbors, and the third had nothing to sell. And Baines had apparently told them he had a buyer willing to pay above market, and could they hold it, which they did, which meant their own neighbors went without for an extra 2 days while the arrangement collapsed. This was not illegal, but it was the sort of thing that a small town remembers, and Harlan Crossing was very much a small town, and it was in the process of remembering quite a lot in those days. There was also the matter of the count. On the 4th day of distribution, Baines appeared at Clara's barn in his heavy coat with a ledger of his own, an official-looking thing with brass corners, and suggested in his most reasonable voice that he wasn't certain her count was accurate, and that he had reason to believe there was additional stock she had not disclosed, and that as the primary licensed feed merchant of the county, he had a certain responsibility to ensure equitable distribution in conditions of shortage. He used the phrase equitable distribution with the fluency of a man who had found it useful before. Clara looked at him. She said, "What is your count?" He said he had reason to believe there were more than 200 bales remaining at the time she began selling. She said, "Where did you get a number like that?" He said he had sources. She said, "Your sources would have to have been inside my barn in November to know my count, and the only people inside my barn in November were Hiram Vassos and Bess Carver, and I trust both of them rather more than I trust a man who told Odell Pratt his sound hay was worthless so he could buy it cheap, and got beaten to it by a 23-year-old woman with a wagon and $40. Baines stood in the barn doorway. Several of the people who had come that day to collect hay were standing close enough to hear this, and they were standing very still in the way people stand when they do not want to appear to be listening, but are listening with extraordinary attention. Hiram Vassos was leaning against a post with the look of a man who has heard the end of a story he has been patiently waiting for. Baines said something about business and proper channels. He said something about licenses and documentation. He said these things in the voice of a man retreating toward official language because the human language had stopped working for him. And then he left, because there was nothing else for him to do, and the people in the barn watched him go. And after he was gone, someone laughed, not unkindly, but honestly. And then several others did, and Clara stood in the middle of it and felt the warmth of it settle around her like something she had not known she was waiting for. By the end of the second week, the hay was distributed. Clara kept back a small reserve for her own animals and for Hiram's goats, which she had included in her calculations without being asked. The payment she had received came out in the ledger to a number that Bess had written carefully in the center of a clean page and underlined twice. It was not a fortune, but it was enough to buy 3 more good goats in the spring. It was enough to fix the barn roof properly. It was enough to get through to April without doing the arithmetic in the dark, with a face that did not want to show what the numbers were saying. She sat at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, in the quiet that follows a crisis, the particular silence of a problem that has been solved and left the room, and she looked at the page and at the number and at Bess's double underline, and she thought about $20 and 300 bales and a man with a brass-cornered ledger and a man named Odell Pratt, who had sat on a porch with the face of a man who'd been told something he already feared. And she thought about the hay, the gray cast, dismissed, misjudged hay that had done its work so quietly that everyone who had laughed at it was now, somewhere in the valley, warmer for it. Hiram came by the following morning with a pot of something from his kitchen, and they ate at the table by the window and watched the snow, which was doing nothing violent now, only existing, covering everything in the patient way of things that mean to stay for a while. He said my father's expression, the one about the ground keeping its own accounts. She said she remembered it. He said, the full version is a little longer. The short version is what I told you. The long version says, and a person who learns to read those accounts is never entirely without resource. She said, that is still shorter than most of what you've told me. He smiled at the window. Commander the chicken had somehow gotten out of the lean-to during the distribution chaos and installed herself in the barn proper, where she sat on a remaining bale and regarded everyone who entered with an expression of settled authority that Bess described as extremely on-brand. The goats were in high spirits. The mule had stopped limping entirely sometime in November, so quietly that Clara had not noticed the day it stopped. Only the morning she realized it had. The barn that had looked over full in September sat now, with its door latching properly, the emptied space inside smelling of good dry grass and animals, and the long cold patience of a winter being managed. In February, a woman named Ellen Esterbrook, whose barn roof had collapsed in the blizzard, came down the road to Clara's place with a basket of early preserves and stood at the door with the particular stance of someone who has practiced what they mean to say and is hoping it comes out right. She said, we were among those who said the Deller property was no good and that you wouldn't last a winter. Clara said she knew. Ellen Esterbrook said they had been wrong, and not only about the property. Clara invited her in. They drank tea by the stove while the February wind made its reasons outside, and when Ellen left, she stopped at the gate and turned back, and she said, how did you know the hay was sound? What told you? Clara considered that. She said, I went and looked at it. I used my hands and I used my nose, and I didn't let anyone else's opinion do the looking for me. Ellen Esterbrook nodded slowly, the nod of someone writing something down inside themselves. Then she went home through the snow. By March, the valley had the quality of a conversation that has turned a corner and knows it. People greeted Clara differently, not with the excessive warmth of guilt, which can be its own kind of diminishment, but with the plain ease of familiarity of a person who has been established and is now simply known. She sold milk. She sold a pair of kids in the spring to a family starting over after the blizzard. She helped Odell Pratt evaluate a second cutting in May that other buyers were skeptical of, and she told him the truth about it, which was that it was fine, and she helped him find a buyer at a fair price. And he thanked her in the way he did everything, briefly, directly, as though speech were a limited resource he had learned to spend carefully. She accepted it in the same spirit. She added 4 goats in April. She repaired the barn roof. She planted the garden. She rehired Hiram in the casual, ongoing way that had become their arrangement, which was to say that he appeared when there was work, and she fed him when he did, and they talked, or didn't talk, as the day called for, and the whole thing had the comfortable quality of something neither of them needed to name. Bess continued to visit, and to name any animal that didn't have a name yet, and to maintain her notebook, which had become a reasonably accurate record of the farm's activities by this point, and which she kept with an organizational rigor that suggested she had a very clear understanding of her own importance to the enterprise. She was not wrong. In the spring she named the first of the new kids for a woman she admired, which Clara was told quietly, and which caused her to look at the small brown goat for a long moment, and then to decide she was satisfied with the honor. There was a morning in May, early, before anyone else was up, when Clara came out of the house to start the day and stood in the yard in the particular silence that May mornings have, that greenish, waiting quiet, and looked at the barn, which was solid and full and hers, and at the garden, which was planted, and at the hill where Hiram's place sat, and at the road where the world came and went, and she felt something she did not have a plain word for, which was perhaps why she did not try to name it. It was not pride exactly, though it had some of pride's warmth. It was not relief, though it had come through enough difficulty for relief to be part of it. It was the feeling of a thing being actual, of something that had existed first as a number in a ledger and a smell of wet grass, and a question answered alone in a strange barn, having become solid and present and real in a way that the world could now see and handle and weigh, and having been found by that world to be worth what she had known it was worth from the beginning. The ground does not care what you believe about it. It keeps its own accounts, and a person who learns to read those accounts is never entirely without resource. Clara Marsh went into the barn and fed her animals and checked the water and said good morning to Commander, who ignored her completely, as was her custom, and began the day.